Welcome, everybody. It is my great pleasure today to welcome Rebecca Treiman for doing this seminar with us today. The talk that she will present is about spelling and learning to spell. But I think many of you know the work of Rebecca because she is a very well-known psycholinguist, not only interested in spelling, what she's going to talk about today, but also on other aspects of language and language learning. She takes a developmental perspective, but also linguistic, and his fantastic work was well-deserved, recognized by the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Awards of the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading in 2014. So I'm very happy to have you here, Rebecca, and so I'm pleased that we can hear you today.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about spelling and learning to spell, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak in this seminar. There's been a lot of work over the years on the cognitive processes involved in reading, including about how adults read words and about how children learn to do so. But there hasn't been as much research about spelling. And I think that part of the reason that spelling hasn't been studied as much is that people often think of it as kind of a niche skill. So if you're in the US, you may have watched spelling bees on television, and you may have admired the contestants' abilities. But you may have thought of spelling as something like being able to do a cartwheel on a balance beam. It's a special skill that requires lots of practice, but it's not really needed in everyday life. And in the case of English, we often think that the spelling system is so irregular and so illogical that being a good speller is mostly a matter of brute force memorization. Today, I hope to demonstrate that spelling is not a niche skill, that becoming a good speller is more about learning the regularities in one's writing system than about memorizing lists of words. And I also hope to show you that spelling can be a good test bed for investigating general issues about the cognitive tools that people construct, in this case, writing systems, and for looking at how people learn and use these tools. So to set things up, let's talk about writing systems in general and about English, the writing system that I will be focusing on in this talk. We often think that the ideal writing system would represent the phonemes or the sounds of a language in a simple and straightforward manner. So every phoneme would be associated with a unique letter, and every phoneme would be spelled the same way in all of the words in which it occurs. We come pretty close to this ideal in the case of the B sound in English. The letter B spells the sound B, and it rarely spells any other phoneme. And the phoneme B is almost always spelled with the letter B. So we do see a distinctive and consistent spelling in this case, but in many other English cases, we do not see this type of situation. So there are many phonemes in English that can be represented in more than one way. For example, the sound E in English can be spelled with the letter EA, as in meat. It can be spelled with the letter EE, as in feet. It can even be spelled with the letters EI, like my name Treiman, that's pronounced as E, and there the spelling is EI. This kind of thing has led some people to label the English writing system as deficient or even as chaotic. And it's true that English has less distinctive and less consistent spellings than, let's say, Finnish or Italian or Spanish. But many of the deviations from this phonological ideal reflect other forces on writing, other principles. So let me tell you now about some of those other principles. Many writing systems, even alphabetic ones, reflect morphology in their spelling. There's a tendency to spell each morpheme or unit of meaning with its own unique spelling. So that means that two morphemes that happen to sound alike are sometimes distinguished in their spelling. In English, we have the word beat, meaning to hit, and we have the word beet, which is a type of vegetable. So those are two different morphemes with two different meanings, but each morpheme has its own spelling. This sort of thing complicates representation at the level of phonemes, but having a distinctive spelling for the two morphemes can benefit readers by allowing them to quickly determine whether they're reading about fighting or whether they're reading about vegetables. Another way in which morphology shows itself in spelling is that a morpheme may have a consistent spelling across different words in which it appears, even when the pronunciation of the morpheme differs. So an example of that would be the English past tense morpheme. It's pronounced one way in jumped with a d. It's pronounced a different way in hemmed. Oh, jumped is a t, hemmed is a d, and then batted is an ud. So those pronunciations are different, but it's spelled in all three cases with ed. And again, that complicates the links between phonemes and letters. But the consistent spelling of the morpheme may be helpful for readers. So if you're reading in English and you see an ed at the end of a word, there's a pretty good chance that it's a past tense verb. Another characteristic of many writing systems is conservatism, a tendency to keep existing spellings. The pronunciations of words change over the centuries, but spellings usually change more slowly. So an example of that in English is that the words bread, as in a loaf of bread, and bread, as in breeding or your background, those used to be pronounced with different vowels. A sound changed caused the vowels to be pronounced alike, but the spellings were not updated. When pronunciations change over the centuries, but spellings don't change to keep up, the links between phonemes and spellings become more complex. And some of the complexities in the English system of spelling sound relationships reflect the conservatism of the spelling system. Another aspect of conservatism comes in when words are borrowed into a language from other languages. English borrows promiscuously from other languages, and it often keeps the original spellings when it does. So, for example, when we borrowed the word rendezvous from French, we didn't respell it in a way that would make more sense for English, such as RONDAYVOO. We kept the original French spelling. This complicates the sound to spelling relationships, but it could help people to identify the source and even the possible meaning of certain words. So to summarize to this point, the spellings of words in alphabetic writing systems reflect several different factors, which sometimes compete with one another. There's a drive to spell each phoneme in a distinctive and consistent manner, promoting what we think of as an ideal alphabetic writing system. But there's also a tendency, especially in some writing systems, to spell morphemes in consistent and unique ways. And that can cause the system to deviate from that alphabetic ideal. Writing systems are also conservative. They prefer to retain previous spellings. When a writing system has been around for a long time, as in the case of English, the sound change that occurs over time in spoken language, coupled with this conservatism of spelling, that causes the writing system to deviate from the phonetic ideal. Some languages have authorities that prescribe spelling reforms, but people's conservatism means that they often resist those reforms. So the deviations that we see from the alphabetic ideal in English and in other alphabetic writing systems as well are not random. They're in many cases systematic. They reflect the forces that I've talked about, and they leave traces that users of the writing system could potentially learn about and benefit from. Okay, well, we've talked a little about writing systems. I'd like now to move to talk about theories of the spelling process. The most popular theory about spelling has been the dual root theory. The idea here is that there are two different ways to spell a word. The first, the phonological root, involves dividing the spoken word into phonemes and then assigning a letter or letter group to each phoneme. When a phoneme has more than one spelling option, some versions of dual root theory propose that people choose among them based on their overall frequency in the language, not by their frequency in specific phonological or morphological contexts. So for English, the phonological root yields the correct spellings for only some words. It yields the correct spellings for words like pad, P-A-D. Those are classified as regular. But for other words like plaid, P-L-A-I-D, the phonological root yields an incorrect spelling. And English has a lot of these so-called exception words, words like plaid, words like friend. And for these, the second root is needed, the lexical root. The lexical root relies on having stored in memory a representation of a whole word's spelling. So you retain the spelling of P-L-A-I-D as a whole. And according to the dual root view, this lexical root is required for many, many words in English. More recently, theories of spelling have begun to emphasize statistical learning. The idea here is that writing systems include probabilistic patterns, context-sensitive patterns, not just one-to-one links between sounds and letters. So, for example, a phoneme may have one spelling when it's preceded by a certain phoneme, and it may tend to have another spelling when it's preceded by another phoneme. This kind of context conditioning can arise because of sound change, as we've talked about, or because of other factors. And according to a statistical learning view, people pick up these patterns from exposure to words and their pronunciations. They don't need explicit teaching. So even when people don't know, for example, about a sound change, they can pick up through implicit learning how that affects the spelling to sound relationships. According to most statistical learning theories, skilled spellers have, after many years of experience, internalized the statistics of their writing system, and they mirror those statistics in their behavior. So these views see skilled spellers as expert statistical learners. Okay, now that we've talked about the dual root theories and the statistical learning theories, I'd like to discuss some studies that have tested these theories. In the first study that I'll talk about, we told people that we would be presenting them with spoken sentences and that they should write down the sentences. We told them that some of the sentences would include some made-up words, but just to write them down anyway. We do often use made-up words in our studies because people would not have stored representations of those to use via the lexical route. So let me give you an example of a sentence from the first study, and I'd like you all to try writing this down on a piece of paper or a computer if you have one in front of you. So here's the sentence. I found a very Salic penny on the ground. I found a very Salic penny on the ground. So can you write that down? Okay, well, that's an example of a sentence that we used in this study with Kessler and Walter. The experimental sentences included non-words ending with either the "uk," like in Salic, or in other cases an "us." And the non-word ending with "uk" or "us" was used either as an adjective or as another part of speech. So in the sentence that I just gave you, I found a very Salic penny on the ground. There, Salic is being used as an adjective. I found a very Salic penny on the ground. Or another sample sentence would be, your new dog is very vobous. So vobous is being used as an adjective there. There were also sentences using the very same non-words, but using them as other parts of speech. So with Salic, for example, do you think the Salic will fit in the car? There it's a noun. If you need assistance, visit the vobis. So a given participant would hear a given non-word just as an adjective or just as another part of speech. They wouldn't hear it both ways. So those were the experimental sentences in the study. We also had filler sentences that didn't contain non-words. So for example, the child's favorite subject at school is math. The participant would hear each sentence twice, and they would be asked to repeat it aloud. That's something that I couldn't do with all of you, but just to make sure that they heard it correctly. So they would hear it twice, they would repeat it. Any errors in repeating the sentence would be corrected, and then the participant would be asked to spell, to write down the sentence. Our participants were community members of the community in St. Louis who had volunteered to participate in experiments. Overall, they were pretty good spellers. Their mean score on a standardized spelling test was 109, where the national average would be 100. But one of the reasons that we used a community sample here is that we had a big range of spelling ability. So we had some people who were rather poor spellers and some people who were quite good. I also wanted to mention that the participants here were all native speakers of English. We use non-words ending with "ick" and "us" because the spelling of these endings is strongly affected by morphology, part of speech. Studies by Berg and Aronoff have provided information about this aspect of the English spelling system. These data that they have put together show that when "ick" is an adjective, for example, it's always spelled with IC. So angelic, gigantic, the spelling is always a final IC when "ick" corresponds to an adjective. But when that same ending corresponds to another part of speech, it's spelled as IC only 33% of the time. So here's a big morphological pattern in the vocabulary. Us, again, when that's an adjective, it's always spelled as OUS. We have words like jealous, OUS. So the us sound is always spelled with OUS when it's an adjective ending, and it's hardly ever spelled with OUS when it's not an adjective ending. Now, dual root views would not suggest that people's spellings would be influenced by part of speech, because there the focus is on the links between the phonemes and the letters. Statistical learning views, however, lead us to expect that adults would be influenced by part of speech, and that they would mirror, that skilled spellers would mirror these vocabulary statistics in their behavior. They should do this even though schools virtually never teach about these morphological patterns. So let's take a look at the data from our participants. We can see that participants used more IC spellings when non-words had ick as an adjective ending than in non-words that used ick with other parts of speech. But you see that the difference was pretty small in the participants, nowhere near as large as in the vocabulary. When we look at the ending us, participants did use more OUS endings for adjectives than for other parts of speech. But again, notice how small that difference was and how uncommon these OUS spellings were. I don't know if I can see the hands here. Can you guys raise your hands, raise your virtual hands if you spelled Salic with IC? Okay, so there are a couple of people who did that, but based on the results of the study, that would not have been the majority. Of course, you guys aren't exactly a naive sample because we were just talking about the effects of morphology here. So a critical thing to notice here is that people did not use those special adjective spellings. They did not use that IC and OUS spelling nearly as often as one would expect if they had picked up the statistics of the vocabulary. 100% versus 50% in the case of IC, and 100% versus 12% in the case of OUS. In further analyses, we took a look at the data based on the spelling ability of our participants. We found that the difference in performance between the adjective context and the other part of speech was somewhat larger for the better spellers. But even the participants who were higher in spelling ability were not using these special spellings as often as anticipated, given the vocabulary statistics. And I'm a good example of this. I have to think really hard when I want to spell the adjective callous. That's an adjective meaning like a mean person, a callous person. That ends with OUS. And then there's a noun, callous, like when you have a callus on your foot, some dry skin, and that ends with US. And even though I'm a good speller, I really have to think, oh, it's the adjective one that has the OUS. And it's the noun one, the skin on your feet, that has the US. So I'm certainly not using this vocabulary statistics as much as I really could. So the conclusions from this study are that people do use part of speech, this morphological feature, to help choose among possible spellings of these word endings. And that's not something that's anticipated on the basis of most dual root theories, but is consistent with statistical learning theories. At the same time, though, people's spelling choices are less influenced by morphology than expected, given most statistical learning views. The idea that skilled spellers mirror the vocabulary statistics is not supported by the results of this study. In this study, and in other studies that we've conducted as well, people are not, even skilled spellers are not taking full advantage of the vocabulary statistics. Okay, well, let me now move to another study in which we address some of these same issues about people's sensitivity to vocabulary statistics. But before I get into this next study, let me ask you to listen to a sentence and write it down. So here's your sentence. Dr. Scap has a tiny leather suitcase. Let me say it again. Dr. Scap has a tiny leather suitcase. So I'll give you a second to write that down. So how did you guys spell the surname Scap? Raise your hand if you spelled it with a single P at the end. Did some people do that? Single P at the end? Okay, how many people spelled it with two P's at the end? Can you raise your hand? I can't see the hands, right? Okay, a few hands. Somebody spelled it with two P's. Did anybody spell it a different way? Maybe like PPE? Okay, okay. Now, it is a little odd when you think about it that some of you spelled it with a PP at the end, because actually in English, PP doesn't usually double at the ends of English words. There is this guy here, Johnny Depp. He has a PP at the end of his name. So here's a surname where PP doubles. There's some other letters like T that don't usually double at the ends of normal English words, but do sometimes double at the ends of surnames. So Pitt, the surname, is P-I-T-T, whereas the normal word pit, like an apricot pit, that's P-I-T. So we're seeing here some indications of letters that don't normally double at the ends of English words, but do sometimes double at the ends of surnames. Some of you may be familiar with this woman, Julie Bugg, my colleague in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Washington University. And she has a GG at the end of her name. G is another letter that doesn't usually double at the ends of regular English words, but does double at the ends of some surnames. So in this study, we're wanting to look at people's consonant doubling and whether it differs in surnames and normal words. So this was a study with Nina Kemp and other colleagues where we're looking at final consonant doubling in surnames and other words. A couple of linguists have discussed the spelling of surnames and has suggested that surnames, this morphological category, may have some special spelling patterns. But nobody had done a quantitative study of how surnames are spelled. So we conducted our own study of the English vocabulary statistics regarding surnames and other words for consonant doubling to kind of set the stage for our experiments. So let me tell you here about the vocabulary statistics that we looked at and how we did this. What we did was to look at one-syllable words that had a single letter vowel and a final consonant. We focused on the final consonants B, D, G, M, P, and T. And these are consonants that do not usually double at the ends of English words. Those were the kinds of items that we're using in our experiment, like SCAP. And our goal is to see how these are spelled in English itself. So we consider two types of words, uncapitalized words, and you see a column for those there, and then surnames. So normal uncapitalized words, and then surnames. The surnames were taken from a list of surnames that were recorded more than 100 times in the US National Census, and the uncapitalized words were taken from a widely used source called Unison. So we divided the words into sets, such that a set contains words that are the same, except they may differ as to whether they're surnames or uncapitalized words, and as to whether they end with a single consonant or a double consonant. So PUT, we have all four forms here. We have the uncapitalized word put with a single final consonant. We have putt, like putting in golf. And then PUT and PUTT are both surnames that occurred in the US Census. But there are only 7 sets of words that had all 4 possibilities like this. In contrast, 131 sets are like those in this row in having an uncapitalized word with a single final consonant, but not one with a double final consonant, and in having both spelling possibilities for surnames, both a single and a final double consonant. So when we fill out the whole table here, these are the numbers that we get for the different types of combinations, the different types of sets. And we use these numbers to come up with 2 kind of summary statistics about how these kinds of surnames are spelled in English. The first statistic is how often final consonant doubling occurs in surnames and how often it occurs in those uncapitalized dictionary words. And you see a huge difference here. Final consonant doubling is way more common in surnames than in these dictionary words that end with P, B, G, and so on. So this morphological category, surnames, has something special in its spelling. We get a second number when we look at within the category of surnames. When we look at the surnames that just have one spelling, we find that in 73% of the sets where there's a corresponding uncapitalized word, there's a double consonant in the surname. So to make that more concrete, the word bug, B-U-G. There, it's quite common to see a surname that only has a double letter form like B-U-G-G. So when there's this uncapitalized word like bug, 73% of the time, if there's a surname, it has a double G to distinguish it from that uncapitalized word. Final consonant doubling is less common in surnames when there's no corresponding uncapitalized word. In that case, final doubling occurs in 45% of the surnames. So to make that more concrete, there's no English word dep. And so there, it would be less common to have a surname with final doubling. It occurs 45% of the time, as with the surname dep, but there's a lot of cases where the surname doesn't have doubling. So just to restate this second finding, we see differences in final doubling within the class of surnames. A surname is even more likely to have a double final consonant if there's a corresponding uncapitalized word with a single final consonant, as in B-U-G, than if there isn't. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. We have differences between surnames and uncapitalized words, and then we have differences within the category of surnames themselves. So we conducted a series of experiments with Kemp and colleagues to find out if skilled readers have internalized these vocabulary statistics. These are not things that are explicitly taught, but a statistical learning view would suggest that people have picked up these differences from their exposure to words in reading and learning about names. So in our first behavioral study, we use noun-words like scap. And we put them in sentences, framing them either as a surname, like in the sentence I gave to you, Dr. Scap has a tiny leather suitcase. Other participants would have heard a scap is a tiny leather suitcase, where scap is used as a common noun. So scap is not a real word in English. So in this experiment, we're using all noun words. these sentences that contain non-words are interspersed with filler sentences. The participants in this study were students at the University of Tasmania in Australia, and on the whole, they're very good spellers. Their mean score on a standardized spelling test is 125, where 100 would be the norm. Participants heard audio recordings of sentences in a randomized order. So Dr. Scat has a tiny leather suitcase, or a filler sentence, the girl is good at math. And they were asked to type the whole sentence, spelling it as they thought best. So some people might have written down the spelling scap for the surname here. That would be counted as a single final consonant. Many of you may have done this. Other people might have spelled it as SCAPP. That would be a double final consonant. They're using the consonant expected based on the sound, and they're doubling it, not adding anything else. A couple people did that. And then some people might have done something else, like SCAPPE, where we have the double final consonant, but also an E. So we put those other spellings in their own category. Okay, so let me show you the results of this study. What you see here are the mean and standard deviation percentage of single final spellings, double final spellings, and other spellings. One thing to notice is that overall, people prefer that single final consonant spelling. That's the simplest spelling, the shortest spelling. But you can see that people used a double final consonant 30% of the time for the surnames, and only 9% of the time for the common nouns. So there's significantly more consonant doubling in the case of surnames than in the case of common nouns. These results are consistent with a statistical learning perspective in the sense that experienced spellers do seem to have picked up from experience that these consonants are more likely to double at the ends of surnames than to double at the ends of common nouns. But on the other hand, people do not double the final consonant surnames as often as anticipated based on the vocabulary statistics. We're seeing a doubling rate of 30% here, and the doubling rate that we found in the vocabulary was 53%. So people are showing more doubling for surnames than for common nouns, but they don't seem to be doubling as often as in the vocabulary. Okay, well, let me now turn to differences among surnames. That's something that we looked at in the vocabulary statistics. We found that final consonant doubling was especially likely for surnames that sound like common nouns. Have people also picked up that pattern? To find out, we carried out a second experiment with 46 students from the same university as in the first behavioral study. For this experiment, we used the same non-words as in the first study, like scap. But we also included 24 real nouns that were matched in terms of their phonological characteristics. So the noun that matched with scap would be chap, like chap as in a fellow. That's a noun that native speakers of English would know, chap. We placed the items in sentences, and we framed them all as surnames. So in this study, people would have sentences like Dr. Scap helps to mend broken bones, where it's framed as a surname, or Dr. Chap helps to mend broken bones. So again, a surname in the very same sentence. And again, there were filler sentences, as in the first study. The overall procedure was the same as the first behavioral study. Okay, well, let's take a look at this second study. You see here the mean percentage of single letter spellings of the final consonant, double letter spellings of the final consonant, and then other spellings. Again, you can see that people overall prefer the simpler and shorter single final consonant spelling to the double final consonant spelling. But you can also see that people use some final doublets, and they were much more likely to double the final consonant when the surname did not sound like a word, as in scap, than when the surname did sound like a word, as in chap. And that is exactly the opposite of the pattern that we saw in the vocabulary analysis. In the vocabulary analysis, if you remember, final consonant doubling is more common for the real word surnames than for the non-word surnames. And here, people are showing the exact opposite pattern. So is this really true? We reran the study using a task where we just presented people with two spelling options, the single option and the double option, and we asked them to choose a spelling. And again, the results showed that reversal of the pattern from the vocabulary statistics. So we're seeing that reversal both in a production task and in a choice task. So the results of the study with Kemp et al. Are partly consistent with a statistical learning view. We do find that experienced spellers have learned through exposure. They don't get any explicit teaching about that. They've learned through exposure that surnames sometimes have final consonant doublets that are rare at the ends of uncapitalized words. But skilled spellers have not picked up another pattern in the vocabulary, that final consonant doubling is especially common for real word surnames. So they picked up one statistical pattern, but they're actually doing the opposite. They haven't picked up that other pattern. The apparent lack of statistical learning in that second case, we think, reflects the strong pull of the familiar. If we already have a spelling stored in memory, like CHAP would be stored in memory for native English speakers, we prefer to use that stored spelling rather than conducting a new one. This tendency on the part of individual spellers to use known spellings may help to explain the conservatism in writing systems that I talked about earlier. Once a spelling has been learned, it tends to stick. The results of the behavioral studies that I've talked about have some implications for the theories of the spelling process, therefore. The results of these and other studies don't support versions of the dual root theory, according to which when people haven't stored the spelling of an item, they spell it using the letter that is most common overall for that phoneme. In some cases, as when an item has a particular part of speech, or when it's used in a particular phonological context, people use a spelling that is less common in the language as a whole, but that is more common in a particular context. And we've seen evidence for people's use of context effects in other studies from our lab and other labs as well. So the results suggest that people do pick up some patterns in the vocabulary, including even subtle patterns that are not explicitly taught. Our results, however, suggest that learning and use of statistical patterns is just one influence on spelling behavior. People also tend to do what is easiest and simplest. So the participants in our studies tend to use single letter spellings more often than anticipated based on the vocabulary statistics because of their simplicity. People also show a preference for the familiar. They prefer to retrieve spellings shown in memory rather than constructing new ones. Finally, people, even when they do show context effects, don't tend to show them to the degree to which one would expect, given the strength of those context effects in the vocabulary. Even in some cases, people show the opposite patterns, as in the study with Kemp. So this behavior of skilled speller does not perfectly mirror the patterns in the vocabulary. Some statistical learning views see skilled spellers as mirroring the patterns to which they have been exposed, as being perfect statistical learning theories. Our results don't support those versions of the theories. Okay, well, so far we've been talking about kind of the details of the spelling process. Now I'd like to broaden things out and look at spelling in a larger context. Is being a skilled speller a niche skill, like the ability to do cartwheels on a balance beam? Or is spelling ability related to reading ability and to other cognitive and linguistic abilities? So here's a thought experiment for you before I present the last study. Suppose that we had a perfectly reliable and valid test of spelling ability, and also a perfectly reliable and valid test of reading ability. And suppose that we gave both of those tests to 1,000 kids between the ages of, let's say, 8 years old and 17 years old. So here's the question: what do you think the correlation between the spelling test and the reading test would be? So think about what you think the correlation is. Did anybody write down a negative number? Raise your hand. Any negative numbers? Okay, probably not too many. How about positive numbers? How many people say between 0.0 and 0.2? Raise your hand. Between 0.2 and 0.4? Between 0.4 and 0.6? I can't see the hands here, but when I've asked this before, quite a few people think between 0.4 and 0.6, 0.6 and 0.8. That's been the most popular answer that I've heard. Anybody think it was between 0.8 and 1? Haven't found too many people guessing a number in that range. So in this study that I talk about next with Hoslander and other colleagues, we took a look at this question. We wanted to look at how individual differences in spelling relate to those in word reading. What is the correlation between the two? There are some theories that stress the similarities between reading and spelling, to talk about how the same kinds of processes are involved in both, how the same mental representations serve both reading and spelling. And so these kinds of theories lead us to expect that the correlation between reading ability and spelling ability would be quite high. Other theories, however, suggest that word reading and spelling involve quite different processes, or even that they're based on different representations, that we may have one mental lexicon for spelling and another mental lexicon for reading. And according to those theories, it might be more, one might predict a lower correlation between reading and spelling, that individual differences in the two might not line up very closely. For example, some views focus on how children can often read a word correctly without having a detailed knowledge of that word's spelling. So a child may be able to look at the word alligator, alligator, and they may be able to read it correctly without really having registered whether that final syllable contains an O or an A. But even without registering that, even without storing that, they can still read the word correctly. They can still gain meaning from that word. On the other hand, when the child goes to spell a word, if they haven't stored the specific vowel in the last syllable, they're not going to be correct. So on this kind of a view, we might expect that there wouldn't be a very strong correlation between the ability to read and get meaning from a word and the ability to spell it correctly. So that was one of the questions that we looked at in this study with Hulslander and colleagues. What is the strength of the correlation between reading ability and spelling ability? The second issue that we looked at in this study was whether certain other cognitive and linguistic skills show differential relationships with spelling and word reading. If spelling and word reading involve quite different representations or quite a different mix of processes, then we would expect that certain cognitive and linguistic abilities might correlate more highly with spelling than with reading, and other abilities might show the opposite pattern, correlating more highly with reading. For example, it's been suggested that phonemic awareness, which is the ability to break up a spoken word that you hear into individual sounds or phonemes, some theories suggest that that should correlate more highly with spelling than with word reading, because of the fact that spelling begins with a sound, a spoken word that needs to be analyzed. So phonemic analysis may be particularly important for spelling. So this was a second issue that we wanted to address then, how phonemic awareness and other skills correlate with reading and spelling. Do they show the same correlation with reading and spelling, or do some skills correlate differentially with the two? To address these questions, the relationship of word reading and spelling to one another, and their possible differential relationship with other skills, we use data from a study that's been going on since the 1990s at the Colorado Learning Disabilities Research Center. One of the center's goals is to look at the genetic bases of reading and other abilities. So these researchers have been focusing on twins. And for our analyses, we picked one child from 1,116 pairs of twins who were aged between 8 years old and 17 years old. Now, I should tell you that children with learning disabilities and children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are intentionally overrepresented in this CLRDC study, because one of the goals is to study the genetic and bases of these issues. Nevertheless, though, there are a number of kids in the study who don't have these problems, and the children in our sample actually had means and standard deviations on standardized reading and spelling tests that were very similar to national norms in the United States. There have been some previous studies looking at the relationship between spelling and reading, but they've almost always used a single test of each skill. And that's a problem for studies looking at correlations, because individual tests are not perfectly reliable. So if you find a correlation between word reading and spelling of about 0.7 or 0.8, as many previous studies using single measures have, and if the tests have a reliability of 0.7 or 0.8, then the true correlation between reading and spelling might be 1 or close to it. So in the present study, we were able to use latent trait modeling to reduce the effects of measurement error. The children in the sample were given a large set of tests, and we had 2 standardized tests of spelling ability, and we had 2 standardized tests of word reading ability. So we were able to construct a latent trait variable for spelling, taking both of those, and a latent trait variable for reading. And I should mention that we use the standard scores on the tests that are corrected for a child's age. So the standard scores that rank a child relative to others of their age. We also had tests of several other cognitive and linguistic skills that have been hypothesized to relate differentially to reading and spelling. One of them was working memory. Some researchers have suggested that it correlates more highly with spelling than with reading. We had 3 tests of working memory. We also had 4 tests of rapid automatized naming ability, and that's something that on some views should correlate differentially with reading and spelling. And this was measured by the ability to quickly retrieve and pronounce something like a digit or a color or a number. We had 2 tests of phonemic awareness, the ability to break up spoken words into individual sounds. As I mentioned earlier, some theories predict that phonemic awareness should correlate more highly with spelling than with reading. These other two skills, arithmetic and vocabulary, here we just had 1 test. So for these, we were not able to construct a latent variable. So let me now show you the correlations that we found using latent variables when possible and single variables in the case of arithmetic and vocabulary. First, let me show you the correlation between spelling and reading. This is very, very high, 0.96. Did anybody guess a correlation that high? I can tell you, I've talked with a bunch of people just asking them, and I've never found anybody to guess a correlation that high, but this is what we found when we correct for these issues of measurement error using a latent variable. Let's take a look now at the other results. Let's concentrate here on the correlations of working memory, rapid automatized naming, phonemic awareness, and arithmetic with reading and spelling. For all of those variables, they correlated equally highly with spelling and with reading. There were no significant differences there. So for example, phonemic awareness does not correlate more highly with spelling and reading, with spelling than with reading in our sample. So that doesn't support the idea that spelling, that phonemic awareness is particularly important for spelling, more important for spelling than with reading. The one variable that we found that showed differential correlation was vocabulary. The correlation of vocabulary with reading was 0.64, and that was significantly higher and quite a bit higher than the 0.56 correlation with reading. We think that this difference may reflect the fact that when a child is trying to read a word, they can rule out certain wrong answers even before they say them by using their knowledge of spoken vocabulary, their knowledge of what is a word in their language and what isn't. So let's take the example of a child who's trying to read the word lemon, L-E-M-O-N. And children may have been taught that every vowel has a long pronunciation and a short pronunciation. So the long pronunciation of the letter E is E, the short pronunciation is eh. So the child might be looking at the word L-E-M-O-N, and they might be thinking, is that lemon with the long pronunciation? Is that lemon with a short pronunciation? But they might know that lemon is a real word, and they might be pretty sure that lemon is not a real word. So using their knowledge of vocabulary, using their knowledge of what's in the vocabulary of the language and what isn't, they can come up with the correct pronunciation. So this might be a reason why having a large spoken vocabulary is more closely tied to word reading ability than to spelling ability. Now, before drawing conclusions from this study, I just want to mention a couple of limitations. All of these children in the study were twins. And as I mentioned before, they were oversampled for reading problems and for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Also, for two of the variables, we only had a single measure. So in the future, it would be great to replicate this study with samples of children who were not twins, with samples of children who are not overrepresented for ADHD and reading problems, and with multiple measures of all of the skills of interest. However, that is going to be time-consuming and expensive if we want a sample as large as the one we have here. Despite the limitations, the results of this study support the idea that word reading and spelling are one and the same almost. They correlate extremely highly with one another when using latent trait modeling to deal with measurement error. And many other cognitive and linguistic skills correlate equally highly with reading and with spelling, vocabulary being an exception. So our results suggest that reading and spelling use the same representation, but that knowledge of spoken vocabulary can sometimes compensate for lower quality representations to support reading, and it can't compensate in that way to support spelling. These findings support the idea that spelling is not a niche skill or a party trick. It's a skill that is closely tied to reading and to other cognitive and linguistic skills. I'd like to close by talking about some implications for instruction and other things in some future directions. With regard to instruction, how should we teach spelling? Do we even need to teach it at all? Well, dual root theory suggests that children should be taught the most common spelling of each phoneme and the most common pronunciation of each letter. Equipped with this knowledge, they'll be able to read and spell regular words. Exception words, which dual root sees as constituting a large percentage of the words in English, those need to be learned by rote. Those need to be stored in a lexical root. Our results suggest that it's too simple to divide words into regular and exception categories. Words that don't have the most common spelling of each phoneme sometimes follow patterns of their own, and people pick up some of those patterns without explicit instruction. On the other hand, our results suggest that explicit spelling instruction is needed. We found that even experienced spellers with many years of experience have not picked up certain spelling patterns that really could benefit their spelling. How should explicit instruction work? Well, typically in English, spelling instruction has involved a lot of rote memorization. This week, we're coming close up on Halloween, and so children might have a list of words to learn that are all related to Halloween. Pumpkin, mask, ghost. Those words are related to a theme, but they don't have any linguistic or spelling patterns in common. Research suggests that this is not a good approach. Instead, words should be grouped for spelling instruction according to their linguistic features and their spelling patterns. And because of the close relationship between spelling and reading, spelling should not be treated as a separate subject. It should be integrated with reading instruction. I focused on English today, but we see similar phenomena in other languages. For example, Spanish is seen as one of the most regular alphabetic writing systems in the world. But it too has certain cases where the spelling of a phoneme varies systematically with the spelling's context. So for example, G is spelled as GU rather than with G when it appears before the letter I or the letter E. So the context in which the G appears affects the spelling. Even though just about all words with the Spanish G sound follow that pattern, children continue to make mistakes on it after several years of experience and instruction in school. So exploring spelling in other languages is clearly an important direction for future research. We also need to learn more about writing systems themselves. Few modern linguists have concerned themselves with writing, and those who have done so have usually done it qualitatively rather than quantitatively. I mentioned the quantitative study of Berg and Aronoff earlier with regard to IC and OUS, but there's some of the few linguists who have really collected quantitative data on spelling. We've seen that we need quantitative data of writing systems and how they work to understand the writing systems better and to be able to compare the patterns in the writing systems to those in the behavior of their users. So to sum up, I hope to have shown you that spelling is an interesting and important topic, and that it's one that provides a good test bed for studying some general issues about the nature and learning of complex systems. I'd like to thank my collaborators on this research, the ones who have double letters in their names and the ones who don't. And I would like to thank all of you for coming to the talk today. So thank you very much. And I think we have a period of time now for questions.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a great talk, and we've had a lot of engagement in the Q&A. I will primarily be going through the Q&A in the order that they came in. If attendees, you would like to ask your question directly, please just use the raise your hand feature as we get to it, and then you can step in and ask. Otherwise, I will read it. All right, so early on, as a general question, we had some people asking about the recording. So I will say the recording will be available on the One World seminar webpage. We had a few other people who wanted to know if they could get a copy of the presentation or handouts. I didn't know if that was something that they could reach out to you and get, or if you would like to direct them to the recording when it's available.
I would be happy to send a copy of the slides, and I could add the specific papers that were referenced at the end, so people could email me directly.
Okay, perfect. All right, so then the next question is from Anastasia Stoops. So she had a question regarding the 2021 study. She asked if you're planning to gather some measures of print exposure or reading experience. She says these implicit facts that you are testing here are coming mainly from written speech. So do you think people who are reading more would pick up on these statistics better than the ones who are not reading as much?
That's a great question. In the study, we did include a standardized test of single word spelling ability. And we found some evidence that people who were better spellers were taking better advantage of those statistical patterns. But we did not include, based on the correlation between word reading ability and spelling ability that I reported, we would expect the better spellers to be better word readers as well. But we did not have a test of reading comprehension. We did not have a test of print exposure. And so it would be a good future direction to look more at individual differences. And I should just mention that in the study with Kemp, we really did not look for individual differences because all of the participants were very, very good spellers and there wasn't a big range. At some universities, and I guess it depends on the population, but at our university, Wayne State University, our students are generally such good spellers that it's not a good population for testing the range of individual differences that one would see in the general population.
Makes sense. All right, the next question is from Aida Fahom. I think this spelling is, I think this finding is so because teaching does not often connect spelling to meaning. Maybe that is something where Aida could step in and talk about what finding was meant there.
I think I know what she's talking about, though. I think is she talking about the so connecting spelling with meaning, that's connecting spelling with morphology. Connecting spelling with meaning is realizing, hey, these words that end with IC have a certain kind of meaning. They make an adjective out of a noun, so that's an aspect of meaning. Or these words that have a double consonant at the end, they're surnames. That's another morphological or meaning-based category. And if we treat spelling purely as a measure of linking up sounds to letters, we're ignoring meaning. And in the case of English, in the case of many other writing systems as well, there are these morphological influences, these meaning-based influences on spelling. So I hope that answered the question.
Fair enough, I think so. The next question is from Christy Zubik. And this came pretty early, so it might, when people are talking about the study, just so you have a sense of when it came in. Was there a comparison between the skilled spellers in the group and the less skilled spellers in the study?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the study with Walter and Kessler, we did run a few analyses comparing, looking at the results as a function of spelling ability as tested with a single word spelling test. And we found some evidence that the better spellers were taking more advantage of those morphological regularities. But an important point is that even the better spellers were nowhere near mirroring the vocabulary statistics.
Makes sense. Barbara Bunn has a question later, but did chime in at a point just to note that her name ends with a double N. So we'll come back around.
Great example, thank you.
We'll come back around to her question in a bit. Urs Kalberer asks, do you see a link between spelling and vocabulary learning / vocabulary retention in an English as a foreign language context?
What a great question. The research studies that I talked about today were done with native speakers of English, so the English was their first language. We do see evidence in the last study that I talked about for this relationship with vocabulary, but those were all monolingual English-speaking children. So it would be very interesting to look at all of these things in people who are learning English as a second language.
Definitely. All right, the next question from John Carr. So there's 3 questions here. I'll go ahead and read it all, but if you want me to go back and kind of give you the first part, I'm happy to do that. So the question is, do you think that the phenomena you've been talking about are mostly just accidents of history, albeit accidents that have turned out to be useful in many cases? Or do you think that these phenomena are the result of some kind of adaptive process? If the latter, do you have any speculations about what kind of adaptive processes might be involved? In particular, how do these special spellings, which are primarily beneficial to the reader, become part of a writing system that is primarily shaped by the needs and preferences of writers?
Some of the phenomena in spelling reflect how sound change occurs in spoken language. And that is by no means an accidental process. Sound change is governed by principles. So, for example, let's take a word like wasp. At one point, that word would have been pronounced wasp, but the S sound changed under the influence of the preceding W, so it's pronounced wasp. The spelling, however, did not change, so the spelling is still A. So now we have a situation where asp, for example, has the A, and wasp has the A, So it's not an accidental process in that there are laws, things like similarity of phonemes that govern sound change, that reflects that it changes the spoken language. Then there's this conservatism for things that are written down. And so we end up with spellings that are written down that are not perfectly reflecting the way that they are pronounced. So hopefully that answers the question in the sense that it's not random. It's many of these things that I've talked about do reflect these characteristics of writing systems. Many times they do reflect sound change. Other characteristics, as I've talked about, reflect how once a spelling is learned, it's tend to stick. And that's not, that's adaptive too. We learn something, we want to keep using it. We learn a spelling when we're 6 years old. That's the spelling of the word, we keep using it. So even when maybe the word is used in a different context or a different meaning, we keep using that spelling. That sticking with what you learned is again adaptive, but may not be always give the right result in the case of spelling.
All right, and now back to Barbara Bunn with 2 N's at the end of her name. She asked, do I have this correct? The original study showed the word as a common noun and then as a surname. The last student just did surnames, I believe this is a study. The last study just did surnames. So the original did word, common noun and surname, and the last study did just surnames.
Yeah, if you're talking about the study with Kemp et al., we had 2 behavioral studies. In one of them, I don't think I can go back to show the slides, but in the first study, people were presented with a given non-word, and it was presented either as a surname, like Dr. Scat had a tiny leather suitcase, or as a common noun. So that was one study. In the second study, they were all presented as surnames, but the type of item was different. Was it a real word like chap, or was it a non-word like scat? So I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. The next question is from Sarah Insura. So regarding the fact that vocabulary correlates more with reading than spelling, the explanation discussed was that having more vocabulary increases your reading ability. I wonder if the relationship could go in the other direction. Is it possible that those who are better readers and read more often end up with more vocabulary? Or was there something in the study that supported a particular direction in this relationship?
That's a great point. The explanation that I talked about is one potential factor that goes into it. And I forget the person's name who asked the question. The person who asked the question is bringing up another factor that may go into this. So there may be several things going into the closer relationship between vocabulary and reading than between vocabulary and spelling. I didn't have time to get into this in the talk, but there's actually, we were using standardized tests of reading and standardized tests of spelling. And there's some interesting differences in the kinds of words that occur on the 2 standardized tests. In English and in other languages, reading is easier than spelling. And so if we were to use the very same words on the tests, we'd have a test where some of the kids are performing at ceiling on reading, and some of the kids are performing at floor on spelling. So test developers have learned that they need to include a different mix of words in the 2 tests. So the words on reading tests are actually less common words than the words on spelling tests. They're less frequent. And some of the fact that the correlation between reading and spelling is 0.96, it's significantly less than, it's super high, but it's significantly less than 1. If we were to come up with a measure of reading and spelling that incorporated both speed and accuracy to get around these ceiling and floor effects, and if we were to use the very same words on the 2 tests, the correlation might in fact be 1. So in thinking about why certain things correlate more highly with reading and with spelling, we need to keep in mind the fact that the reading and spelling tests that we used, like virtually all other standardized reading and spelling tests, do not include the very same words. Okay. And so that kind of strengthens what the person asked. The reading test may include words that are found in more sophisticated reading materials.
Right. All right, we have a question about sharing your research study. So I believe you said if people reach out to you, they can get not only a copy of the presentation, but you can give the resources and the papers that you talked about as well, correct?
Of those that are published.
Yes.
I was presenting some pretty new research in this talk, and some of it is published and some of it's not, but I'll share the published research.
Okay. Yeah, this question might have been about the not yet published.
Right. That's
okay. So we'll hold off on that.
They can write back to me in a year or two, and hopefully I'll be able to share it at that time.
Sounds good. All right. The next question is from Jennifer Nowicki. And she says, I'm here as a teacher of students with dyslexia and other learning differences. Would Dr. Treiman please recap and elaborate on implications for instruction?
Oh, that's great to have some people in the audience with that background. So I talked about how instruction that is influenced or within a dual root perspective talks about teaching spellings for sounds. It typically teaches the most common spelling of each phoneme. For some phonemes, they might teach two possibilities, like E, that a certain sound might have two possible spellings, but typically it's just a single spelling for each sound, or at the most two. And the idea is that children learn those links, and then all of the words that don't follow those just have to be memorized by rote and stored in that lexical root. So I talked about how it's not really the way English works, that children, that there are these more probabilistic kinds of patterns, that even when a sound has two possible spellings, it might be the case that one spelling tends to be used in certain kinds of words and another spelling tends to be used in other types of words. So children can learn not only that, this sound has two possible ways of spelling it, but they can start learning, here's the kinds of words where you spell it this way, and here's the kinds of words where you spell it this way. So for example, presenting words in groups. This group has this spelling, this group has that spelling. Another implication for instruction comes from, and I don't know the specific program being used with the dyslexic children, but certainly in schools for typically developing children, spelling is often taught. Here's a list of 10 words. I give you the words on Monday. You're going to have a test on them on Friday. Children are given no clues as to how to learn the words. And many times the words are not chosen because they share particular linguistic features. So I had given the example of words that are all related to Halloween. They're related to a theme, but they don't share particular features. So that kind of spelling instruction does not work so well because it's not really drawing attention to the linguistic basis of spelling. So those were a couple of the implications for instruction that I talked about. I think sometimes teachers of dyslexia are more knowledgeable and skilled about reading and spelling than other teachers.
Makes sense. Thank you. All right, Aida Fahum is back and saying, thank you so much. Would you be able to share any thoughts on programs that integrate reading and spelling, as well as support teachers and students in understanding the linguistic features and spelling patterns of words? So I know you were just talking about this a bit. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add.
Yeah, I did talk about the need to integrate reading and spelling. I'm not an expert on specific programs, so I really can't say here's a program that does it well, here's a program that doesn't do it so well. I feel like as a researcher, I can talk about here are some of the things that research says should be incorporated into instruction. And it's a whole other set of skills to actually do that and to prepare the programs. And then you have a third set of skills to really evaluate those programs, knowing both about the programs and about the research, and to evaluate how well the programs exemplify that. So I'm comfortable kind of giving general implications, but I'm not comfortable saying, here's the program that you should use.
Sure, fair enough. All right, Sonia Cabell says, thank you for your amazing talk. Even though reading and spelling are highly correlated, can you talk about development? My understanding is that spelling and reading are more synchronized when children are beginning to invent spellings, for example, kindergarten, but then lag about a year behind reading development as students develop.
That's a great question. In the study with Auslander et al., what I presented in the talk was the correlation between reading and spelling for the whole group of 1,000 kids, so 8 to 17. In some other analyses that I didn't have time to get into in the talk itself, we broke down the results according to the children who were below the median in age, so that was about 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, and then children who were above the median. And we found that the correlation between reading and spelling was higher in the younger age group than the older age group. It was very high in both groups, but it was higher in the younger age group than the older age group. So I think that goes along with what Sonia was saying about the closer relationship between reading and spelling at the younger ages.
Fascinating. All right, we have an anonymous attendee. This is a similar question. One learns spelling by reading words, and reading experience is a major source of vocabulary development. So, is the high correlation of reading and spelling a consequence of reading experience rather than of identical processing demands?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we talked about that, and I think that's probably a good explanation there. In this particular study that I presented, we did not have any good measure of reading experience. There are tests that can be used, author identification, title identification tests, but we were not able to use that latent variable approach to have a good measure of that.
Okay. And Aida Fahim just jumped back in to clarify when we were talking about our questions before that it was the finding from our research, and yes, so we covered that. Another anonymous attendee asks, since reading and spelling is significantly correlated, can fluent readers be poor spellers? And I think you mentioned that a bit before as well.
Yeah, it's very, very rare. Those two are so highly correlated that people who are good at word reading are almost always good at spelling, and people who are poor at both one are almost always poor at the other. There have sometimes been claims that there is a group of kids who are good readers and poor spellers, or poor spellers and good readers. But our results suggest that individual differences in the two are highly correlated. It is the case, however, that spelling is harder than reading. Spelling is harder than reading for everybody. So we all have words that we're good at reading and that we're poor at spelling. But our position, I mean, I'm better at reading than most people and better at spelling than most people, but I still have these words like necessary. I really have to think about it when I want to spell it. Or as I mentioned, callous and callous, I have to think. I get it right, so I score them right on the test, but I really have to think. So yes, spelling is harder for me than reading, but yes, I'm also above the mean in both. Likewise, a child tends to be below the mean in both. But we do need to take into account that spelling is the harder of the two for everyone.
Right, thank you. Marie Foley says, I love the example you gave of the words callous and callous. I was so curious, I looked up the etymology of these words. The words callous and callous are etymologically related from Latin, callous meaning be hard. It makes so much sense when you realize they came from the same etymological root. Connecting spelling with etymology, is this something found impactful in your work and research?
I haven't done research on this myself, but there is a lot of research on the teaching of reading and spelling, programs that incorporate morphology. You're not going to, use the word morphology with a second grader, but you can talk about the history of words. You can talk about where they come from. You can talk about the parts within words without using technical terminology. And there are indeed some studies suggesting that that type of teaching is beneficial. So this gets back to another question. We don't want to teach spelling as something that's just involving the sounds. We want to bring in morphology and meaning as well. There are questions about how to do that. There are questions about when to introduce that to children, but that is something that is very helpful, yes.
Barbara Bunn is back asking, I'm especially interested in the implicit learning involving adjectives. I work with bright students with different, often undiagnosed, profound problems with reading. It would be lovely to follow a further extension of this study in application, possibly including a teacher's method of study for the child or children to include some researched repetition of possible implicit learning that is indirectly provided in the student's learning atmosphere. I hope I said this in a way that could be understood.
Mm-hmm. That's a great idea. We need more research that connects directly with teaching, where we know what teachers are doing, where we can manipulate what teachers are doing, and where we can look at the effects on children's learning. So that would be great.
And she followed up again. I was comparing the first part of the first study to the separate study that showed different results. So I think this is going back to her original question. Let's see if I can find that real quick, which was the original study showed the word as a common noun and then as a surname. Maybe she was actually asking about a different question. She also had a question about adjectives. Barbara, if you want to raise your hand and ask this directly, if we're not getting it, feel free. Otherwise, I'll assume that we have answered the question.
I think we've talked about that, yeah. Yeah, if anybody has a question, they could also email me. I do see a hand up there. Is that Barbara?
That was Barbara. So if Ryan, if you could unmute Barbara. I would do it, but I don't have the ability to do it. Ryan, can you unmute Barbara? Oh, you need to unmute yourself. Sorry about that. Barbara, go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Well, it seems like we're having some issues.
I think I got it. Did I get it?
Yes, you got it. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. You gave a study that was of 54 people, and you did it with the surnames, and then you also showed it as an uncapitalized common noun. And that's where you had that higher percentage of the double consonant at the end of the name. After you said the second part of that study, I believe you got to a third study that was done separately, that was only surnames with 46 students. Was that was done with non-words and real words, but you were only showing them as surnames. My question is, do you think the fact that in that first study you showed them as an uncapitalized common noun and a surname allowed the thought process to say, hey, this could be two different things, whereas in the last study you only presented the words as surnames, so they didn't get that extra influence? You understand what I mean?
I think I do. In the second study, that's right, they were all surnames. If people have, however, picked up that some kinds of surnames are more likely to have double consonants than others, then we would have expected people to make a differentiation among surnames within that class of surnames.
Mm-hmm. So you don't think that the people would make that differentiation having been presented with the fact that it could be an uncommon or an uncapitalized noun or a surname?
Well, it actually could be a good suggestion to include all three within the same study.
Okay, that's what I meant. Thank you.
Study. That's a good idea.
All right, excellent. Next question is from Vikram Jaswal. I appreciate the nuance you offered that learners are not perfectly mirroring the statistics of a writing system. Those statistics is clearly playing a role. I wonder if you could talk a bit about what kinds of abilities may be relevant to a learner's likelihood of internalizing statistical regularities in the writing system.
That's a great question. One thing that we've already talked about here is reading experience and vocabulary. Spelling skill, we found in one study that spelling skill was related to internalizing these regularities. Other than that, we don't have any direct evidence. Most of our studies, as I mentioned, have been conducted with university student populations at universities where people don't show a lot of variability in their spelling ability or their print exposure. I mean, all college students read a lot, all are pretty good spellers. So I think to really tackle these questions, we need to look at a broader population. So I welcome your suggestions about what kinds of abilities might be tested if we do go out and look at a broader population. We've talked about a few already, and Vikram or others, I would appreciate your suggestions as to what other abilities you think might be relevant.
I have a question. I believe you've already covered this, but just to make sure, since reading and spelling are significantly correlated, can fluent readers be poor spellers? Why might that be?
Well, it's very, very rare.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about, if you have a correlation of 0.96, and the fact that it's not one might just reflect the fact that the reading and spelling tests are using a different kinds of words to some extent. So I think that if we were to have, the ideal latent trait variable study involves 3 tests. We only had 2. So I think if we had 3 tests, and if we had tests that captured both speed and accuracy, and that were able to use the same words for reading and spelling, I think that individual difference correlation would be 1.
All right. We have an anonymous attendee. Anything you wanted to add to that?
We don't know. That's just a guess.
Oh, fair. So given your research findings, how should the dual route model be modified or updated to include statistical patterns acquired implicitly?
That's a great question. There are some computational dual route models now that include sort of a connectionist linking between sounds and spellings as the phonological part of the model. But those still are going to be limited if they do not consider part of speech, morphology, and so on. If we're just thinking about the phonemes themselves. And if we know that the English writing system and other writing systems take morphology into account, then that system that learns the connections between the spellings and the words will need to incorporate aspects beyond the identity of the phonemes. But I think that could be done by incorporating some kind of a connectionist or associationistic learning module as one component, and then you could have your lexical component as well. So I think that based on the results I've talked about, both the dual route kind of models and the statistical learning kinds of models have been found wanting, and both of them need improvement. I might also mention, I didn't have time to talk about this here, there are a couple of specific connectionist and spelling models that we've tested quantitatively in some of our studies as well. But I don't have time to get into that.
All right. Another anonymous attendee asks, the problems of dyslexics with spelling while being better at reading point to differences in the demands. What about differences in the quality of orthographic representations and whether those are less robust for dyslexics, as Elbro has argued?
Oh, I think that, if by orthographic representation, we mean our stored knowledge of how words are spelled, that's almost by definition worse in dyslexics than in typical readers and spellers. One interesting avenue for future study, and this is something that we've been looking at a little bit in our own research lately, is how we score spellings. On standardized spelling tests, and in many researcher-designed tests, in many tests that are used to diagnose dyslexia, for example, we spell a child's spelling as correct or incorrect. we score a child's pronunciation of a word as correct or incorrect. But we are missing valuable information when we do that. So one child could spell a word and just get, one letter wrong. They're counted as wrong. Another child could misspell that same word and have a much more extreme spelling error. They're also counted as having one item wrong. So there are ways to score where we can get more directly at the quality of the orthographic representations. We can do this through the kinds of edit distance measures that are used in computer science and even genetics too, where we look at the number of transformations that are needed to turn a child's spelling into the correct spelling, or with reading to turn the pronunciation that a child gave into the correct one. And we may be able to get better information about how good or bad a speller a child is if we use those kinds of measures. And getting back to the issue about how closely spelling and reading are related, we need to keep it. In the study that we did, we used standardized tests that score all errors as equally bad and that don't take error quality into account. So some of the small independent variance that we found between spelling and reading could reflect that. So researchers who look at young children's spellings often do go beyond just correct or incorrect. But those who look at older children and adults are just looking at correct or incorrect and missing information that could be useful, for example, in diagnosing and helping children with dyslexia.
All right, we're nearing the end. This might be the last question. Deborah Jarrett asks, in the studies you presented investigating statistical learning of spellings, you looked at the spellings of consonants. Might vowel spellings be more influenced by the statistics in the language?
That's a great question. In other studies, we have looked at how both children and adults spell vowels as a function of the context in which the vowel occurs. I'd given an example earlier with the A in wasp and wad, so that kind of thing. We do find that skilled spellers are influenced by context. They spell the same vowel sound differently in some contexts than in others, in accordance with the statistics of the language. But there too, even skilled spellers are not as influenced by the vocabulary statistics as one would expect. So they're not varying their spelling of a given vowel as much based on the context in which the vowel occurs as they ideally should, given how it's actually spelled in English. So yes, we do see discrepancies with regard to vowels as well as consonants. But yes, Deborah, that's a good observation that I was concentrating on consonants today, and we do see some of the same kinds of phenomena for vowels.
Fascinating. Well, this has been incredibly interesting. Do you have any final words, take home, that you would like to share before we wrap up?
I just would like to thank everybody for coming. Spelling is kind of a niche subject, and sometimes when I say that I study spelling, it's like, oh, that's kind of weird, that's kind of different. But I appreciate the interest that everybody showed, so thank you very much.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone, all the One World seminar attendees. We hope to see everybody in San Francisco for the annual meeting. Otherwise, we will see you back here, or not otherwise, hopefully both. We'll see you back here for our next One World seminar. Will be January 24th with Arturo Hernandez. He'll be speaking about sensory motor plasticity and cognitive flexibility from a neuroemergentist approach. So we hope to see you there, and we will enter Dr. Treiman's email address for receiving slides. We've gotten some questions there. I think a lot of people want to reach out to you. So thank you so much for your time, and hope to see everyone in San Francisco.